None of the players on your dynasty team matter. Okay, that's obviously not true. But what is true is that most of the players on your team matter less than you think, and that your fear of giving up those players and embracing the unknown is probably slowly but surely killing your dynasty team. I know it's been a couple of weeks since my last video, but I am back now. I was in England. Not sure why I'm pointing this way. I don't know if England is this way or not. Anyway, it was a really cool trip, but I do not recommend traveling internationally with a toddler if you can avoid it. Anyway, I don't have any other trips planned, and I'm ready to crank out Dynasty content all summer. So just go ahead and hit that subscribe button now before we get started. Somehow we are already closing in on 1,000 subscribers. I don't know how that's possible, but I'm not mad about it. But today we are going to be sticking with dynasty strategy, building on some of the ideas I talked about in my most recent videos. Later on, I'm going to be giving kind of a basic umbrella principle or a rule, if you will, that you can apply that over time is going to increase the value of your dynasty team, and maybe, possibly, it could help you to build a super team. Now, we know super teams, they don't really exist in the sense that you're going to win your championship every year, but they do exist in the sense that you can avoid ever having to rebuild. You always have a plethora of draft picks and that sort of thing. Now, before I get into this rule, we do need to establish some basic truths, starting with how fantasy matchups typically play out. Something you might not know is that most fantasy football matchups are blowouts. I promise you this is true. Narrow victories in fantasy football are actually pretty rare. And if you want, you can pause the video. You can go to one of your leagues, look back through all of the matchups in this past season, and you'll find that the majority of them are decided by well over 15 points. But if you don't want to do that, just sit tight because I do have some evidence. Starting with an article that Adam Harstad wrote. If you don't know Adam Harstad, great follow on Twitter, one of the better dynasty minds out there. I'll put a link to his profile and also this article I'm about to talk about in the description. But this article from way back in 2014, it was actually about consistency and whether consistency matters in fantasy football. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But what I was interested in here is that Adam actually took one of his leagues and he looked at all the matchups like I was just suggesting that you do. And he was checking out the margin of victory in all these matchups. And this is how he frames it in his article. So I'm just going to read from what he wrote. He says, I went through the weekly results from that league and asked myself a simple question. If you took the losing team and added Jamal Charles' weekly average to his total, 25.33 points per game, how many times would the losing team have won? Basically, if the winning team got his 9 players and the losing team got his 9 players, plus Jamal Charles too, how often would that have changed outcomes? The answer to that simple question over the course of the season was just 52.6% of games, just barely more than half the time. So in other words, Jamal Charles, the best player in fantasy that year, was only able to swing about half of the matchups. It's really a fancy way of saying that more than half of the games were decided by over 25 points. Now that's just one league, but I also have some data from Adiko, whose work I referenced 2 videos ago, I believe, when I was talking about playoff win percentages. I think this comes from the same study, but he took about 900 leagues and he looked at all the matchups, and across 74,000 regular season matches, the average margin of victory was 35 points. So in other words, 35 points between the winner and the loser on average. And the median of that was 30 points. So the median, I think, is interesting too, because obviously you're going to have some really big blowouts. You know, teams that are tanking face the best team in the league. That might expand the average, and maybe that's going to warp the results. But even the median, that middle value, is 30 points. So that's still a huge gap between the winner and the loser in most games. And there's a lot of other interesting information on this chart. For example, we can see if we combine these 2 boxes that only about 18% of matchups were within 10 points, which means the other 82% were decided by 11 or more points. In his article, Adam Harstad actually pointed out that narrow victories and narrow losses are the more memorable ones. And because of this, we overestimate how often they occur. But these are the facts. Most of the time, at the end of the day, even when you get into fantasy playoffs, the games are not going to be close. There's a lot of takeaways from this information, but the direction I want to go today is this. We can take advantage of managers who overvalue the impact and importance of replaceable players. Now, getting into what exactly defines a replaceable player and looking at things like wins above replacement, it's beyond the scope of this video. We're not going to do that today. For now, I just want you to think of players like Jordan Addison or Amari Cooper or James Cook. These are lower ceiling players, kind of your wide receiver 2, running back 2 types. They have almost no shot of being top 12 at their position, and you can forget about top 5. I don't want to get too hung up on the specific player because it's more about the the general rule. But if you want to leave a comment about a specific player, you're not sure if they would be categorized as replaceable, I can talk it out with you. It's not necessarily like a binary thing. It's more of a sliding scale. The point is that these replaceable players, they have this sort of cozy feeling about them. It's nice to fill out your roster with these types of players. It makes the screenshot of your starting lineup that you post on Twitter look a little bit better. But the truth is that these players are less important than you think. The reality is that star players over the course of the season really carry the load for your fantasy team. They have a disproportionate impact on whether you win or lose. Now, I need you to bear with me here. I'm going to make kind of a weird analogy, but if your fantasy lineup is an outfit, right? The star players on your team, they're the shirt, the pants, the shoes. They really make or break the outfit. That's what people are going to see. The rest of the players on your team, they're just kind of like socks. Yes, socks are a part of the outfit. They have a role to play. You'd rather have socks than not have socks if given the option. But if one of your socks wears out, you're not really worried about it. They're easy to replace, right? And you're not building your outfit around the socks. You're not starting with the socks and saying, okay, now how do we get an ensemble that works with these socks? This is probably the most number of times anyone has ever said socks in a fantasy football video. But the thing about socks is that if the rest of your outfit is nice enough, there's no way anybody's going to know if you're wearing cheap socks. They might not even notice if you're wearing no socks. Sometimes people like to do that. It's gross, but they do it. And I know that this is a weird analogy, but I think it puts in perspective how little those players matter in comparison to the star players. There's a bigger gap than people think between the players that are genuinely tilting the outcome of games and the players that are kind of just along for the ride. I have just seen far too many dynasty managers overpay for these types of guaranteed points that these replaceable players are giving you, when in reality, these are players who have an incredibly low chance of actually mattering. We have a finite amount of value that we can allocate to our fantasy football teams that we can use to spend on different players at different positions to maximize our point scoring potential. You don't want to go out and blow the budget on the most expensive socks that you can find. You can go out and get the budget socks. They get the job done just as well. You know, you look at last year, right? Jordan Addison scores the same points per game as Adam Thielen and Jacoby Myers. Just a couple more points per game than guys like Brandon Cooks, Curtis Samuel, Josh Palmer, Romeo Dobbs. Replaceable players are considered replaceable because you can find comparable production at lower costs. Players like Terry McLaurin and Chris Godwin and George Pickens are typically held in high regard, and they've been valuable in the past because of this. But in reality, they're only scoring a couple more points per game than very, very cheap veterans that you can acquire and replicate most of that production. And if we remember that most games are being determined by 25, 30 points, is there really a big difference when you're talking about 2 to 3 points per game between your wide receiver 3 or your flex player? Not really. To quote Adam Harstad one more time, for most teams, the root cause of an early exit will probably be attributed to not enough good players. That's fine as far as explanations go, but I can provide a better one. Not enough great players. Because in fantasy football, good players are nice enough to have, but it's the great ones who determine fates. So what does all this lead to? Well, we know that most fantasy matchups are not close. We know that star players are disproportionately responsible for wins and losses. We know that replacement level production, think Romeo Dobbs, think Curtis Samuel, is easy to acquire in most leagues. The logical conclusion here is that we should be chasing those star players that can actually tilt matchups in your favor. So where do those players come from? Well, you either draft them in your rookie draft, usually in the first round, right? You go out and you draft a Bijan Robinson or a Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round, or you draft a Jamar Chase or a Justin Jefferson, or you package up a bunch of things and you trade for those players. But it's a lot easier to trade first round rookie picks than it is to trade a hodgepodge of replaceable players. Go to your league, take like 4 guys off of your bench, try to put them all together and see if you can buy a superstar with that. It's just not possible. And this leads finally to the point. I did not mean to string you along for all that time, but this video required a lot more setup than I initially expected. But the rule here is always accept future firsts for non-premium or replaceable assets. I don't care if it's March or October. If you are offered a first round pick for a replaceable player, you always accept that trade. And I'm talking about even a 2026 first, even a 2027 first. That player you're trading away, they might feel integral to your team's success. They might feel like that one Jenga block, you pull it out, the whole tower is going to come crumbling down. That's where the fear comes in. We're often afraid to give up these players we have because we think that they're more important to our success than they actually are. But if that player is scoring 12 points per game, 14, even 15 points per game, I assure you, they do not matter that much. You should be trying to stack up those future picks whenever you can because number one, they always gain value over time. these rookie picks, the longer you hold on to them, you're just accruing interest on that investment basically. So the longer you can hold on to those picks, the more you can get out of them, and you can end up flipping them for even better assets, which brings me to my second point, which is that they are really good trade chips, ammunition to help you get those legit stars that we're talking about, the ones that can actually make a difference for your team. And third, if you don't end up trading the picks for legit stars, you at least have them to use in your rookie drafts, which is where you can draft those types of players, those difference making players. And holding on to picks gives you the chance that you end up with a really early one, right? Things happen all the time that are crazy in fantasy football. Variance happens. You can end up holding a pick that looks like it's going to be top 5 or top 3. And that doesn't happen when you are clinging to each and every one of these replaceable players that you just don't want to give up, because what if one day I need to start them? You know, how is my team possibly going to survive if I trade away Bryce Young? Just as a quick disclaimer before I proceed, this does depend a bit on your league, the activeness of your league. How liquid is your league? You know, how many trades are getting done on a regular basis? If you find your league's kind of gridlocked and it's really hard to make deals, first of all, you should probably just leave and find a better league. But if you insist on staying, you have to be a little bit more cautious about this. If teams in your league aren't willing to make these trades, if they're all clinging to their players, then you might find yourself having trouble making these types of deals. But you can also try to get more creative with your trades. They don't just have to be 1-for-1s. Another format of trade that I think can work well is when you take a player that has a kind of a higher perception, and you can tier down into a lesser player that can maybe give you comparable production. And then you can do like a first, second round pick swap. You can upgrade a pick to that first round where the upside is so much greater. Zooming out here, a little bit of a big picture. As we've talked about in the last couple of videos, your odds of winning a league in a given season are fairly low. So the goal is trying to build and maintain a valuable and competitive roster over a number of years, as long as you possibly can, trying to sustain that. And turning these replaceable players into future firsts, it's one of the ways you can sort of keep the ball rolling with your teams. So let's wrap this thing up with a personal example, because I just made a trade yesterday that I think encapsulates some of the ideas we've been talking about here. I took over an orphan team in 2022. It was in really bad shape. I had to kind of do a 2-year tank, which I don't like doing, but there was just nothing on this roster. But I'm coming out of it now, entering my 3rd season with the team. I know this is a little bit different than what we've been talking about, because I didn't care about points anyway, so I didn't need points on my team. But I do think that this illustrates what future firsts can actually net you in a trade if you are patient and when the circumstances break right. This manager approached me about a trade because he wanted to get his 1st and 2nd round pick back so that he could then enter a rebuild. And so I kind of have a bit of leverage there, right? Because he knows if he gets his pick back, he can potentially turn that into the 101, the 102. Because the upside potential of getting that 101 was so great, I was able to get Barkley, Evans, Henry, and upgrade my starting lineup in a massive way. But that's the power of 1st round picks. And that's the end. Hopefully you were able to follow all of that and got something useful out of it. If you did enjoy the video, please hit the subscribe button. We are marching on to 1,000. We'll not stop till we get there. And leave a comment if you have any questions about this concept, or if there's anything you'd like me to explain further. Be happy to go over that with you in the comments. Otherwise, take care, and I will see you guys in the next one.